Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Hello and welcome to Asia Tech Podcast Stories. My name is Graham Brown. Today, we're going to look at the fast-growing retail market in Asia. Let's put this into context a little bit. The latest data from China alone, obviously that's just one market in Asia, is that the Chinese retail market is worth $4.8 trillion, of which 840 million is e-commerce. So do the math, it's about 4 trillion just on non-e-commerce retail in China. That's sort of traditional bricks and mortar retail, which is bigger than the US alone. So it gives you some idea of the size of that market. And as I said, that's just China. We haven't talked about all the other markets that make up Asia as well, which are growing rapidly. So what are the latest trends that we need to be looking out for? And to answer that question, I'm joined by Carson McKelvey, Managing Partner of Tofu Gear. Carson, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. You're in Hong Kong, yes?
Yes, I am. It's a wonderful city.
Yeah, great. I absolutely love Hong Kong. We'll talk about Hong Kong and Asia in a minute. I want to put this into the context. I'm based in Tokyo. And here in Japan, we have this word, which is a new word, which is bakugai, which describes the phenomenon of Chinese tourists coming to the Tokyo Prada or Louis Vuitton store and cleaning it out. You know, you'd have these coach loads of Chinese tourists coming on effectively what are brand tours of the retail stores in Tokyo. And that word bakugai is kind of a new phenomenon in the last couple of years here in Japan, and it comes from the root in Japanese gai from shopping and baku, which means explosion. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a new phenomenon here in Japan, but you're based in Hong Kong and you've been living in China for a while. This isn't new to you, right? You've seen this sort of explosion of shopping behavior in Asia for quite some time now, I guess.
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, you bring up a funny point here. It's and it's so true, especially with markets like Japan, Korea, and also even some countries in the Middle East. Dubai is also seeing a lot of this. These Chinese consumers that are traveling and making the travel experience and finding ways to integrate shopping into that as well, which is where a lot of the trends that we see today are actually coming from. So Japan's a great example, and brands are already taking advantage of this. So one example is actually from Richemont Group. So you think, oh, big, old Richemont, which is, those fine watches and things. Mm-hmm. They have a new retail concept that's been around for, I think, a couple of years now called Time Valley. And so that is essentially a culmination of several, or most of their brands, and some brands that are not their brands, all in one space in downtown Tokyo, and in-town duty-free. So you buy the products in the store in Tokyo, and you pick them up on your way back to China at the airport. And it's entirely focused, almost 100% on Chinese tourists. All the people in the store speak Mandarin. Some of them don't even speak Japanese. Some of them don't speak English. They all speak Mandarin, though. And that is entirely what that business is all about. So it's funny you mention that, because it's one of the key driving forces, I think, behind a lot of the things here happening in Asia on the retail scene.
That's really interesting. I was unaware of that. And I imagine that, that's just one of many kind of incidences of these retail stores really upping their game, because you kind of imagine that they're with it, they're at the cutting edge of what's going on, because they're connecting with customers, people walking in and they're getting feedback on a daily basis. But it's not often the case, is it? Is that retailers can be quite a traditional industry and averse to change, isn't it? Because, in a way, it's a bricks and mortar industry, so there's a lot of overhead, et cetera, et cetera. So to embrace like these new ways of doing things seems obvious to us, but in retail, if that's all you ever knew, I think there's kind of a resistance to change, isn't there?
Yeah, actually, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a resistance to change. It's more, I would say, just a lack of understanding and a lack of abilities or skills, or just where to get started. Because with a lot of these things, and this is one of the unique things about what I do in my company, because we do a lot of you can call it transformational work with our projects, with our clients. And what we find is actually everybody's very open to change. They know they must adopt what I like to call kind of like a change behavior or a change mentality, which is being open and capable of dealing with change in a very rapid environment, a very agile or resilient environment, let's say. But what most people actually, their problem is working in retail is they don't know how themselves, where to start with some of these issues, how to be innovative, how to be, gearing towards the next generation of consumers, these problems. And more importantly, they don't know how to do it within the context of their organization. There's lots of great, you can call it self-help guides and, frameworks and all these things out there brought on usually by professional services, which are very cookie cutter, attempting to do one size fits all, follow the golden path, and it will lead you to the riches on the other side. But the truth is, for most businesses, that's not the case. The one thing I always talk about, at least from the digital side, with my sort of insights and presentations that I usually give, when people talk about digital transformation in retail, that's true, but the main transformational component here isn't actually the digital part, because most of the technology that's being adopted or integrated is been there for a while for the most part. The transformation that's happening is really actually a relationship transformation and an organizational culture transformation. That's really where the change is happening. And so the hesitation is not so much from, a lack of will luster or whatever to change. It's more so just nobody really has the guts or
right.
They don't know what to do without taking serious risks from a career point of view, let's say. So it can be very challenging for some people, especially with some organizations, where it's not the right culture to do it, and so it never happens.
Yeah, exactly. And often the people who are there at the coalface, seeing the need for the change, are not necessarily the ones who have the power to change it. It's often, taken at headquarters, and there's a bit of a distance between these, traditional retail organizations where they had the head office and then the retail branch and so on. But we'll go into that in a minute. We talk a bit about change within retail, especially in the context of Asia as well. Let's start at the top and talk about Tofu Gear. What exactly that is and what the problem you're attempting to solve there is.
Okay, so in a very brief nutshell, Tofu Gear is a unified commerce platform provider, or I should say more like a solutions provider. So what we do is, you can imagine like what traditional software vendors do for retail, whether it's like a digital commerce solution or a mobile apps, point of sale systems, warehouse management systems. Okay. Usually, when a retailer needs a new one of those things, or they want to implement one and they don't have one, as an example, maybe they want to upgrade their POS system, their point of sale system. They'll hunt for, 10 different vendors with different POS offerings. They'll narrow that down to 3. They'll go through a request for proposal or an RFP process to then pick a vendor and go with it based on who's got the best price, who's got the most bells and whistles, and that's it, right? Nowadays, it doesn't really work very well because, companies are charging more money for these things because there's a lot of bells and whistles, there's a lot of things that need to be customized for solutions, and worst off, the sort of ecosystem or the infrastructure that makes up the company as a whole, their IT infrastructure, has become much larger and more complicated. So introducing a new system becomes a very long and expensive process. Okay, so at Tofu Gear, what we decided to do is, let's assume like if we were starting from scratch, right? What would a retail business look like from a systems perspective? What would be the easiest way to manage the business? What would be the most effective way to deliver the best customer experience and make that as seamless as possible? And so what we ended up coming up with is our own platform, which is end-to-end in scope. So that includes point of sale, e-commerce, mobile commerce, social commerce, everything to do with commerce, and everything you need to do to run a retail business and operate all on one platform. And it comes down to the whole, like, this omni-channel buzz. And this is kind of where the issue and where a lot of people get hiccups. If you've been following kind of the latest shows and the latest insights, you get a lot of people coming out from retail, from professional services, from the analyst world, and from the tech world as well, even sometimes. And they're saying, omni-channel isn't really doing anything for us. We're not seeing the benefit. And the issue is because...
back up a bit. What exactly is omni-channel? So assume that we don't know anything. We don't go to these retail conferences. What does that mean?
Right. So, of course, omni-channel you can think of in a traditional sense, let's even take it a step back, okay, to define these things. So in retail, before the internet, before technology, we had what we would call a very single channel business. You would go to a store, you would buy something, and you would take it out. That was your store channel, okay? Or maybe you had a mail order. So, for example, you read a magazine, you like something, and you put it, cash in an envelope with an order slip, and you send it off in the post, and you receive your product sometime thereafter, right? That's very single channel. You're a mail order company, or you're a retail brick and mortar company. Then what ended up happening was we had this magical thing become, sort of force its way into society, which we call the internet, okay? Then we have all sorts of interfaces and ways to connect to the internet, and using the internet as kind of a sort of bridge against any barriers to physical space. Okay, and so what ended up happening was now you can shop in a store, but now you can shop online. Okay, and now even in kind of more modern times, you can shop on social media platforms. You can shop on specific platforms designated for shopping. You can shop on your mobile phone. You can shop via apps, via fixed programs on a device, right? There's many different ways you can shop. And so the reality of today's world is very what we would call multi-channel, right? So you have many different channels in which the business can engage with customers and customers can shop. Now, the reason why we differentiate omni-channel and multi-channel because of inherent with the word, right? Multi implies that there are many. Omni implies there are many, but at the same time. So with omni-channel, the idea is you can be shopping in one channel and then maybe swap. So I could be, for example, in a store, but then I can carry that store experience online and continue my shopping process or my checkout process, if you will, on a website, for example, or maybe it's on a mobile app or something, right? The point is the consumer has the choice to choose when and how they interact with the brand and what sort of engagement that follows that. But the problem with omnichannel and why I don't like omnichannel in today's world and why many people are probably seeing some not so good case studies coming out of trying these things is it's very surfacey. It's taking the same old business mentality and applying it just with technology as a band-aid and tools to kind of connect what is still a very old business model. So while businesses who are following this omnichannel sort of strategy have been able to capture customers very seamlessly in a 360-degree view, right? They have that. But what they don't have is the ability to then manage that and operate on that. They don't have any way to actually use this across the business because the business itself, how it is structured, is still very siloed. It's still very traditional. So you'll have some guy who's the e-commerce director. He's responsible and only measured based on e-commerce performance. If the stores then do something that may or may not, and it's always a debate, right? Drive more traffic to the stores, right? That e-commerce director, his KPI is getting taken away from, right? And then the retail guy who's running the retail stores, he's getting more sales in his stores or her stores, and he's getting the bonus at the end of the year, right? Where the e-commerce guy, the e-commerce didn't do as well, and sometimes it's vice versa, right? And so there's always kind of this sort of mentality where the KPIs, because they're always measured based on that silo for each individual person or each individual department, that there's not very much actual incentive for them to work together to necessarily say, hey, my store channel is going to help drive online sales and vice versa. And so inherently the mechanics and the operations behind it are still also very segregated. You'll have orders being made online being fulfilled from one location, whereas orders that were placed in a store but for delivery still being fulfilled from the store. And they're not sharing inventory visibility. And that creates, broken experiences at the end of the day. So why we say we're a unified commerce company, right, going back to the original question, is essentially to solve that problem, to not only have that so-called omni-channel customer experience and have that capability and that sort of what we like to call customer centricity, right, where the customer is in charge, they get to choose how they want to engage with the brand, but also be able to fulfill on that side as well, to be able to offer that same level of seamlessness inside the business itself. Okay. And the best way to do that is to have a platform, one platform, to run the entire business. And that's exactly what we provide.
Gotcha. So just to summarize, so I understand properly, that omnichannel is very much a buzzword within retail today.
Yeah.
And what it promises is to deliver some seamless experience for a customer, such that the customer can take an experience. Maybe they see something online, like they see a pair of sneakers online, they go to the store, and that's a seamless experience. Even like syncing up inventory and pricing and all those kind of things, offers and campaigns. That would be the omni-channel promise. The problem, however, is that at the end of the day, as you say, this is very surfacey, that organizations still operate in their silos, i.e.
Yes.
that the e-commerce manager, if he was to run some kind of campaign and drive a customer to the store, and he went then and bought from the store, the customer bought at the store, then the e-commerce manager could be losing out, because his reward and measurements are going to come down to what he does on the e-commerce side of things, not what happens across the whole group, right? And that's the fundamental problem. That's why you're talking about creating a platform. Okay, so that's interesting and very noble as a course to be able to tackle that. I think the challenge now is tackling that, because you're dealing with cultural aspects within these organizations. And, that I'm just going to be naive here because I don't know how this actually works, but that sounds like that would work really well for a small retailer who could easily engineer their business around something like that. But let's say I was a larger established retailer, like a Burberry as an example, with online, offline and everything, that would be a lot harder for me, because I'm trying to not just build an experience for the customer, but I'm also having to reorg the whole brand, right? So how does that work in reality?
So the reality is, businesses that try, and I've seen it time and time again, to kind of, say, oh, we need to transform, and they kind of, embark on these huge sort of organizational restructures, these huge like new implementations. They go shopping for all the latest IT stuff. Those usually don't work very well. They end up spending a lot of money really fast and getting very little done. What works really well, and where we have seen the most success, is not necessarily, for at least speaking from my industry's point of view, it is not something that my competitors would like to do, because they don't make a lot of money doing it. But to go through the process of actually taking kind of like a try, or let's call it a test and learn approach, whereas rather than going through these things in a very huge kind of massive change, it's more like a very baby step approach. Let's try something small here, try something small here. Let's see what the impacts were here. Let's see what the impacts were there, and use that as a basis for making bigger decisions later. So rather than speeding into it and saying, okay, we are really committed to this, which is all great and fine, but taking it on a step-by-step approach, being very agile and fast to fail. And willing to fail, because that's where you learn the most, is through failure. Fast and willing to fail, I think, is an essential component to that. So the way we do it with our clients is always a very partnership kind of oriented approach. Everything is done at a very small scale to begin with, and grown out from there. So it's never something that's really just like, oh, I need to restructure everything overnight. It's more something like, let's take one step and adapt, take another step and adapt, and continue that adaptation process.
So what would be a quick win example that a retailer, you've seen maybe across multiple retailers, where they could take this approach and see results without obviously making some kind of cross-organizational change? You're kind of like selling in the concept first, isn't it? Are there any those kind of quick wins if you were to go, as you say, not necessarily the omni-channel approach, but the unified approach?
Yes. So I can't name any examples by name, because there's too many legalities and things that you can imagine from my business. But
generalizations.
The best approach I've seen is starting even within the organizational level, at a region, a particular region. Maybe it's Hong Kong. Hong Kong, I've always found to be an interesting place because it's such a great test market. The city is very well connected. Mobile penetration is something like 200 something plus %. That is, on average, people have more than 2 connected data-enabled smart devices, smartphones, and things like that with SIM cards or whatever. Okay, taxi drivers here really inflate that number because they have on average like 7 devices or something ridiculous. But that point aside, it's always been kind of a great test market. Other test markets are free trade zones in China, Japan, you name it. There's a few of them out there that just work really well for some reason, for one reason or another, I should say. But the point is, start regionally, start local, engage local stakeholders, and set up what I like to call a dream team. And a dream team, and this goes right back to that issue of that, KPI and performance issue, is it's made up of a little bit of everyone, and everyone on the team gets measured the same. And it is how the success of this new strategy as a whole works. So you'll have someone from retail, you'll have someone from IT, you'll have someone from marketing, someone from ops, maybe someone from finance, maybe one of the senior management, top management, if you will, as well, involved in the whole process, managing different stakeholders and things, and making it something that's part of the organization, that is to be professional changers, not for the sake of change, but for the sake of improvement, for the sake of effectiveness, for the sake of efficiency. And maximizing results in that way. And the dream team is responsible. Okay, so maybe you have someone from e-commerce, but you also have someone from the brick and mortar side, going back to the original example. They're being measured the same, right? And starting at, even from an organizational level, starting that way. And then looking at it from the systems perspective, looking at it from the customer experience perspective, looking at it from the business and operations process design perspective. These are kind of the three main areas that we talk about, right, as it relates to people's jobs in retail. And really starting small on every single level. And then going on from there, just seeing where it takes you, because at the end of the day, there is no one-size-fits-all. At this stage, once you get to this point, there really is no one-size-fits-all solution to follow.
Well, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get an idea, like to picture it, if you like, so people can understand what the manifestation of that would be. So you talk about, obviously, the importance of putting together cross-departmental teams, which kind of breaks out those silos and that sort of infighting for resources. So you create this dream team of people who want to make change. Explain that to me in terms of, okay, well, how does that actually manifest in a retail store? Would that then be a store would be run by this team, or you would have within a store a concession which would be run by this team, or what? How would that actually manifest?
From our experience, it's always been at least one store that they would try this on. And not just from the operations perspective or the systems perspective, but again, how that store is managed, and even the associates as well who work in the store, who are actually meeting with customers, who are that front line. Very important to have them involved, especially in the continuous feedback loop. That is probably also another considerable point to make, which often gets overlooked, because there's basically whenever these businesses undergo any sort of initiative or any change, there are two sets of people that always get ignored. One is a store associate. Two, surprisingly, is the customer. Nobody ever bothers a customer. What if we had this new, sort of e-commerce capability where you could buy online and pick up products in store? Would you like that? And it's literally as simple as asking customers that way, that you could actually get a lot of feedback about before you invest. And I think the greatest example of this is I've seen many companies, and it's especially here in Hong Kong because of the sort of hotness for next day delivery, but I think that's can be applied for pretty much any market in Asia. Everybody wants to be able to, who's doing fulfillment, final mile delivery to customers at their homes and things, they want to be able to deliver next day. But if you look at research and you look at actual studies, and there's many of them out there from Forrester, from McKinsey, from, you name it, everybody's done a study on this. Actually, more than 80% of customers are perfectly happy to receive products within 5 working days, or 5 days, let's say. Next day delivery is very marginal in comparison to, for example, being able to order a product while you're in a store that is out of stock in that store. So I go to a store, I want to buy something, I try on a bunch of stuff, I figure out my size, and the one I want to buy, they're not in stock. Most stores, in fact, like less than 12% of retailers today, if I remember correctly, this is a BRP statistic, so they're pretty good at this stuff too. Less than 12% of retailers actually offer the ability to have what we call endless aisle, which is essentially there's no inventory limit. If it's not in the store, somebody will help you order it. And get it delivered to your house in a very convenient way. And that can provide so much more value. Just simply looking at the numbers. You mentioned in the very beginning, right? The retail market in China is a $4 trillion industry, right? Mm-hmm. And only around 10% of that actually is e-commerce. The rest is brick and mortar, right? So is getting final mile delivery done in a day really that important compared to being able to say really offer the best fulfillment experience inside your actual physical space where everybody is still shopping? Mm-hmm. I think it's a pretty obvious answer. But the surprising fact is the expectations between retail brands and what is being done because of just the hotness of the topic, right? Versus what customers are expecting, there's always this gap. And so having a team, going back to what we were discussing before, having a team to be able to sit down and objectively measure this as this dream team is supposed to do, because they don't care about how well the e-commerce is performing versus the in-store commerce. At the end of the day, what needs to be looked at is this is just a retail brand. It is one retail brand, not 3, not 4, not measured by channels, okay, going back to even before. And it's really just one single retail experience and being able to measure that success across those channels. And that's really what the heart of the problem is. So, yeah.
Do you think that what you're doing is easier? I mean, this is I suppose a bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to try it anyway. Do you think it's easier doing what you're doing in Asia because maybe a number of the brands have less of a legacy and therefore maybe it's easier to work with them because they have less to lose, and maybe also the customers have different kind of expectations, whereas people have been shopping for generations maybe in other countries and that's kind of what they're used to? It's just sort of a very blunt question. It may not be the case, but I'm just curious at what the Asian angle is here as well in terms of what you're doing and how that makes it relevant being based in Asia, what you're doing.
Yeah, for what we do, being based here was completely by choice. So there is a strategic element as providing our services because, as you kind of mentioned, there is a bit of a different dynamic here in Asia that you can't find in Europe right now and that you certainly cannot find in the US right now. But that is not necessarily because of my industry or the competitiveness or even what you mentioned about legacy systems and whatnot. Every business is going to have what we call quote unquote legacy systems, right? Even if they were made only a few years ago, they will still have some legacy type systems because systems are constantly adapting and changing, and that's just a respect of the market that I'm in, which is being that guy to actually offer more of a service of making sure that the systems that our clients are using are always up to date, are not legacy, they're always the newest and greatest technology. But that's not the real point here. The real point here is it actually comes down to the markets themselves and the way consumers shop and how retail businesses are able to kind of service those markets. And Asia is something that is completely different than the US right now. So obviously in the US, e-commerce is a big topic, and US always being kind of a big sort of topic in retail in and of itself. Whenever we're talking about trends and things, the U.S. is always used as kind of a benchmark. And I think that's a bit of a fallacy because the markets here in Asia are so different and so much more, more dynamic. Whereas in the U.S., the trend is very stable because,
How do you mean they're more dynamic? Can you sort of just justify that a little bit so people can understand what you mean by that?
Yeah, so great example. In the U.S., right, the space between cities geographically is quite large. A lot of people live in suburban or in more rural areas, let's call them, in the United States. And so for practical reasons, it's very costly to have stores all over the place, as what basically happened in the U.S. Over the last decade. People built stores everywhere, and the whole competitive edge was to be where the customer was, regardless of where that was. Now, customers are a little bit more fickle. They shop online, it's more convenient. And for that market, it makes a lot of sense. Now let's compare that to Hong Kong, right? Or really any city for the most part, but especially Hong Kong. It is, in effect, a country. Okay, it's a special autonomous region, but it is essentially like a country, the way it works here in terms of borders and everything, right? So you can't just go across it's not like your day job to go across the border and go shopping at the shopping mall next door that's in mainland China, right? You kind of go with what you got here. And nobody orders anything online because most of us live on top of shopping malls. There's no point. Why do I got to order something online when I can go down there, I can touch the product, feel the product, I can ask questions to the store associate, and I can get that whole in-store experience that is, in many ways, in this case, actually more convenient than ordering something online where I got to fumble around with some websites and figure out, oh, did I get the right size, the right color? Is this going to look good on me? Is this really what I want? There's no incentive there, and yet everybody still says, oh, Hong Kong's just lagging behind in e-commerce. I don't think they're lagging behind at all in e-commerce. I think everything is what it is because that's what the consumer decides what it is, right?
The consumer's not demanding e-commerce. The consumer's just demanding more convenience, right, and a better experience. And
exactly.
In the US, e-commerce has been a way of doing that, but in Hong Kong, as you say, it's not necessarily the way, right?
Exactly, but then it gets down to how you define e-commerce. Because see, for me, I don't define e-commerce as the very single channel-minded approach where e-commerce is you go onto a website, you buy something, and it gets delivered to your home. For me, e-commerce is just simply the fact that you can view, see, and potentially do some kind of commerce activities online, whether that is ending the transaction there or not. So many Hong Kong consumers, because of the connectivity, because of the speed of the internet, everybody here has a smartphone or two. It is very normal behavior to go online and search up a product or search up a store, see what's available in that physical space before buying. And so having that same capabilities of e-commerce, and in some cases they'll even reserve products. That's another popular thing to do. They'll make a reservation or they'll book a sort of, you can call it like a consultation or, just some time with a store associate, so they're kind of guaranteed that their time is being well spent when they go to the store. These are all things that are really hot right now for retail in Hong Kong. But when you look at Hong Kong, right, it's still relatively speaking to the rest of the world, a fairly small market, albeit a very key market in most cases, but a very small market. So then how does that compare to, say, China, which is, an arm's length away, relatively speaking? You go to China and everything changes. Cash disappears. The use for cash is gone. Okay? Credit cards even gone. Why? Because everybody uses WeChat. WeChat is the dominating force behind day-to-day transactions and commerce. So while we might deploy one solution as an example from a technology perspective in Hong Kong, how that looks like for like a China counterpart will be absolutely completely different. And you don't get that in the US. You don't get that even in most European markets. It's a bit the same. Whereas the dynamicism and the difference in changes in consumer behavior from market to market to market, you go to certain markets in Southeast Asia and compare them with, say, China, compare them with Japan, compare them with Korea. It's a relatively small geographical area with so much diversification. China is like a completely, if you look at them almost like from a geneticist point of view, they're completely different completely different DNA. They're like almost completely different species of consumers. They shop completely different, and it's all through WeChat, and it's all through online platforms as being the basis, and physical markets and places still playing a very key but supporting role. Whereas again, where if you come to Hong Kong, it's the exact opposite. Physical space, brick and mortar, is commerce. The rest is just a supporting role. It is a function of consumer loyalty. It is a competitive edge to have. It is not something that is necessarily the place of commerce and the place of transactions. And where a lot of people get kind of stuck is they see trends like from the US, they see trends sometimes even from China, and they think that is the direction of retail across the board. That is what we need to focus on. But that's not the case.
And that's fascinating. I mean, even how it changes within what would be 20 or 30 kilometers if you were going from Hong Kong to the border to Shenzhen and so on. I'm curious, you mentioned as well that you talked about trends, and now that we're on the subject, there's something I want to ask you about, which is you've really just teed that up in your last statement about what's happening in the US, for example, as a sort of a lead into what could be happening in the world and so on. There's been two really big developments in retail, especially on the news side of things in the last year. You've got, for example, Amazon buying into Whole Foods, which was, Amazon's shift from being, almost predominantly online to having now an offline presence. And I know they probably don't see it like that because of the way they're organized, but, they're buying into a retail store which had a very, very strong customer base. And then you also, you've seen a similar shift as well. You've seen Alibaba in that space as well now in China. So it's very, it's very interesting. I wonder what you make of that. That two of the world's largest e-commerce groups, providers, are now buying. Well, in a traditional sense, we're buying down that chain, but we can't look at it in that sense. But that's how traditional retailers probably would look at it. What's going on?
Yeah, it's really, I would say, quite natural, I would say. When I first heard about not just Alibaba, but also more recently with Amazon, it didn't come much as a surprise, because the truth is, it's kind of the least understood right now from a history perspective, but by far the most kind of blue skies, most potential, greatest potential for growth is competing not by the traditional 4 Ps of marketing, so that's product, price, promotion, place, right? That's how we typically think about the different variables of competition, right, at a very high level. But sort of the fifth element, which is not a P, but an E, and that is the experience, right? What experience, what sort of emotional experience are you getting from, engaging with a particular brand or engaging with a particular retailer? That's really what's differentiating different brands today. So they're not competing anymore on brand or 4 Ps. They're actually competing by what experience they're getting for their consumers. So if you look at, and compare traveling as an example compared to retail and the growth in travel around the world, that's a really good indicator. If you look at restaurants, right, food and beverage is starting to dominate shopping spaces because they're more experiential. People go there, they get to taste food. It's a place to gather with friends and with colleagues and acquaintances, and sort of, it's not just about the product that you're getting in the box, right? You're not going to a restaurant to get some takeout food and sit down and eat it, right? You're going there because somebody's going to serve you something nice, something warm, something sizzling, right? There's more of an experiential component to that. And so retailers that are sort of kind of really next generation or ahead of this are the ones who are providing those kinds of what I like to call sizzling experiences. And again, it goes right back to what I was saying before about Chinese consumers and their traveling. They're going shopping while they're traveling because that's part of the travel experience. They're going to new markets, experiencing new things, but at the same time picking up some new, the latest, handbag or the latest jacket, or maybe a new set of makeup, or maybe a new watch, whatever you have it. They're going and doing those things all at the same time because, first of all, it goes into the Chinese genetics of sort of the consumer behavior today, which is very nouveau riche, kind of like what you would have seen in the U.S. in the 1950s. And I think that's kind of really some of the same logic or the same thinking, just in a more modern context with technology and the capability to travel and sort of blending of borders and things. So that's really where a lot of this is actually coming from when you think about it. But at the end of the day, the experience is where brands are starting to differentiate themselves, and just the impact that has in Asia is much larger than you would see necessarily, definitely for the United States, but even a little bit in Europe as well.
Fantastic. That was a great walkthrough in the Asian retail market, and that was Carson McKelvey, everybody, a managing partner of Tofu Gear. Carson, before you go, we want you to share with us some links, or a link where people can find out a bit more about you, your story, and or Tofu Gear.
Yeah, let's just go to our website, tofugear.com. You can see pretty much everything about our company, what we do. Do watch out for us at some events as well. We do sponsor, host, and or organize a lot of events, especially in Hong Kong. So if you're in the sort of Hong Kong area and there's any retail events, then you'll probably meet us there. That's the best way to put it. So
fantastic. And I see as well you have like a little demo booth as well with mini shops, mini retail stores, right? Actually at these events where you can kind of walk up and test things, right? That must be quite an experience.
Yes, we're very big on that. We don't like to sell what we call vaporware. So we're very big on making these experiences and bringing them to life and letting people touch and feel them for themselves, and not just, talk about them all the time, right? So
yeah, fantastic. Carson, thank you so much. And we didn't talk about your backstory as well. Obviously, the listeners listening to this may see a change in the audio quality in the last sort of 5 minutes, but that's because Skype was playing up. So we had to cut things a little bit short. But there's such a fascinating backstory as well there about yourself, Carson. But maybe that will be the subject of a part 2, unfinished business in that story. So please come back on at some point in the future and update us on that. And hopefully with Skype playing ball with us a little bit better, we can get the full insight into, how you ended up in China and Hong Kong as well, and the reasons why you made that jump from where you started out. But as I say, that's unfinished business. That's something for the future. So Carson, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights today. That was fascinating.
Sure, yeah, my pleasure, and of course happy to come back as well. Looking forward to it.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.